Hey, it's Dr. Gianna Reams, and I'm back. We're going to start our discussion of sources. This is going to be a short video. Um, I might call it more method than content here, in that I'm going to just talk about some terminology that I'm going to throw around in other videos. So for some of you, this is going to be a basic video. I already know all that. Why are you telling me all this? But for other people, you may be unfamiliar terms. So I kind of want to bring everybody up to speed, so to speak. So in terms of sources, as I said in my introductory video, there are three basic types of sources. We have our written sources, we have our visual or art sources, and we have material evidence. Okay, and this is what ancient historians are dealing with. Things usually fit into one of those three categories. Coins are a bit of an exception because they contain art. They're also used at archaeological sites for dating purposes. Archaeologists love finding coins, they help. And also, they sometimes have writing on them. So three for the price of one. The other thing about sources is that they sometimes contradict each other. Both within, so you may have two written sources that have different versions of a story. Visual evidence may be contradictory sometimes. That's less often of a problem. What we see, I guess, the most often, besides the internal written evidence contradictions, are material evidence giving lie to written evidence. Kind of going back, and if you ever watched that old TV show House, one of House's favorite lines was, "Everybody lies." Yeah, okay, and that's true in history too, and or at least they pretty things up a bit. And so our archaeological evidence sometimes gives lie to or contradicts or shades differently what we're being told in the written sources. And sometimes it tells us stuff that the written sources don't bother to tell us, okay, because they already knew. Or they didn't think that that was important. So we can find different pieces of evidence from different sources. Our written evidence is mostly at this period of time from men and from elite men, upper class men who can read and write and have the time to sit around reading and writing. So if you want to know about women, if you want to know about the slave class, if you want to know about immigrants, if you want to know about the so-called subaltern groups, it's not going to be in the written sources, not very often. And when it is, it's going to be shaded by who's doing the writing. Archaeology is often a way into that. So archaeology can offer correctives to things that are missing in our written evidence. Tombstones are wonderful, for instance. Inscriptional evidence is wonderful. The ancients had enough literacy, at least in Greece and Rome, that graffiti was a thing. And sometimes it wasn't all that different from what you find on a modern bathroom wall, minus the phone numbers. So all of this gives us another picture, another way into the ancient world. So all of these sources are important whenever we're looking at anything in the ancient world, certainly Alexander, and especially early Macedonia, where our written sources are very thin. Now, there's another division between sources that I will use sometimes, and that's between your primary sources and your secondary sources. And as you may be able to guess from the terms, our primary sources are the sources that come from the period we're looking at, so from antiquity. Secondary sources are the sources, us, writing about the primary evidence. So these videos are a secondary source. But especially when we're looking at the ancient world, we can sometimes have kind of intermediate. There's still considered primary sources, but they're not exactly at the time. And this is especially important when we are looking at Alexander. So you can kind of maybe think about these as levels of sources within the sources. So, as I alluded to earlier, when it comes to Alexander, none of our surviving written histories date to his lifetime. None of them. The earliest is Diodorus. And Diodorus was writing somewhere between about 30 and 60 BCE. Now, Alexander was born in 356 BCE, died in 323. So Diodorus is writing about 300 years after Alexander lived. Okay. And they just get further on. Okay, so you've got Diodorus, and we'll go into these guys later, but just for dating purposes, you've got Diodorus, then probably Curtius. There's a little bit of question about his dating. Then you have Plutarch and Arrian in that order, and then finally you have Justin. Two of these aren't even writing in Greek. Curtius and Justin are in Latin. Okay. And then we've got Alexander mentioned in a variety of other written sources, some of which are a little bit closer to his time. Demosthenes, the Athenian orator, mentions him, and Demosthenes certainly was from Alexander's time. He kind of famously tussled with Alexander's father. So we do have a few written sources. They're not histories, however, and these are what we call forensic speeches for the most part. That is, it's a politician giving a talk, and even more than modern politicians. Ancient politicians weren't held. There was no fact checking. So they said whatever they wanted. Ergo, you have to be really, really, really careful about this stuff. They aren't pretending to any history. So this gives you an idea of some of the struggles that we deal with when we're looking at history in general and Alexander in particular. So between Alexander and the sources we're reading about Alexander, we sometimes have missing sources in the middle. Okay, so we don't have them anymore, but the people writing did. But here's the catch: they're not cut and pasting. Okay, they are editorializing. Okay, so this is very, very important to understand when dealing and reading the sources. So we may have at least one, and maybe two, even three, in between what we have now and Alexander himself. And of course, Alexander was a master of marketing. He was very careful about his image and what he had put out there himself. So you can even talk about Alexander's own propaganda via Callisthenes or someone else. So these are all the things that we are looking at and dealing with sources. And whenever I start talking about them in a little more detail, then, and I say primary sources and secondary sources, etc., you know what I mean by source.